Welcome to Coffee Talk. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and join us. Today, our guest is Dr. Bryan Alexander, an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, teacher, mentor, friend, a senior scholar at Georgetown University. He's the author of The New Digital Storytelling, Creating Narratives with New Media, Gearing Up for Learning Beyond K-12, and most recently, Academic Next, The Futures of Higher Education. After a number of years working for organizations such as NIDL, which is the National Institute for Technology in Liberal Education, Bryan founded Bryan Alexander Consulting, LLC, through which he consults throughout higher education in the United States and abroad. He received his PhD in English literature, language and literature from the University of Michigan, and he's taught literature, writing, multimedia, and information technology studies at Centenary College of Louisiana. Bryan's work in the nonprofit sector, working to help small colleges and universities best integrate digital technologies, coupled with his past roles as co-director of a regional education and technology center, Director of Emerging Technologies, and a senior fellow with NIDL, he now speaks and writes articles frequently. He's appeared in interviews in the Washington Post, MSNBC, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, US News and World Report, amongst others. I think many of us have heard of at least one or two of those, Bryan. And he's currently a senior scholar at Georgetown University, and he teaches graduate seminars in their Learning, Design, and Technology program. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bryan Alexander. Hi, Bryan.
Hello, AJ. Thank you so much for that introduction, which just sounds like, it sounds very tiring, actually. Thank you.
Well,
It's very, very kind of you. And thank you for hosting me. I appreciate it.
well, you would know if it was tiring. So let's start off real simple. You're not just a good guesser, right? So what is a futurist? What's involved in being a futurist?
A futurist is somebody who works to help other people think more effectively about the future. So they help them think with more vision, more creativity, and with more strategy. It's not exactly prediction because we're often pointing the way towards multiple possibilities. And we do this using a whole variety of tools that the profession has evolved over the past 50 years. Some people do this, they're trained academically. There's a series of master's programs around the world that do this. Some are futurists on their own, through their own training. We have multiple journals, conferences, we have, of course, websites, professional associations, and so on.
So your book is wonderful. Everything I've ever read by you is wonderful, but the recent one is really prescient. You refer to pop futurism, though.
Mhm.
What is that?
Well, in some ways, that's people who do futures work without, say, academic background or without professional rigor, but nevertheless produce visions of the future for everybody to see. And they can be people who do this as part of their other work. You know, for example, Michio Kaku will often deliver visions of the future of science, which is his field. Or you could also think as well about pop culture examples of the future. I mean, movies like Tomorrowland, or in fact, just a lot of science fiction films. Not all of them, but a lot of them will try to offer various visions of the future. I mean, these are pop in the sense they're popular, they're part of pop culture. But I would distinguish them just slightly from the work of professional futurists.
So I want to jump for a second away from that and to some recent events. We're still all waiting to hear what's going on with the US election.
Mhm.
It has been an incredible year for many things, not the least of which is, of course, this monumental election.
Mhm.
So how do you think that the recent election will impact higher education?
Well, it depends in part on how it turns out. I mean, right now, the odds are for Biden to win, but that still hasn't been determined. And if either presidential candidate wins, either of them will face a strongly divided government. For example, in the US Congress, The House is Democratic, although the majority of Democrats has been narrowed by this election. The Senate, who knows at this point? It seems up in the air, but it'll be tight. If there's a Republican president, they will continue to face the dislike of most of the bureaucracy in government. If it's a Democratic president, they'll face the opposition in many ways of a 6-3 Republican majority on the Supreme Court. So either way, it's going to be difficult to get things done in general, much less in particular for education. I think that if the Trump administration wins re-election, they'll continue some of their agendas. And most of their agendas have really been aimed at K through 12. I mean, that's where Betsy DeVos, the head of the Department of Education, has really been focused. And so, that's an emphasis on privatization, for example. In higher ed, the DeVos administration has had a few interesting developments, a few interesting policies. One of them is reversing the Obama administration's decisions on a couple of key areas. One is sexual assault and harassment. So they've weakened the Obama administration's guidance on that, and they've also gone back on the Obama administration's huge push for quashing bad for-profit higher ed. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, the National Student Clearinghouse published their most recent enrollment data, and they showed that while enrollment dropped everywhere in undergraduate education, community colleges, state schools, liberal arts colleges, research one universities, the only place where undergraduate enrollment increased was for-profits. So it may be that the DeVos administration, so the DeVos department under the Trump administration has had some impact. So if Trump wins, we should expect more of that. Which may lead to a rise in sexual harassment and assault on college campuses, or perhaps just less in the way of campus procedures and lawsuits. And it may mean that the for-profit sector continues to grow. If Biden wins, there's a lot up in the air. Viewers and listeners will no doubt recall that the Democratic primary process was very contentious. Quite a few policies were up in the air. And higher education came up this way. The party's left, represented, say, by Bernie Sanders or by Elizabeth Warren, pushed for, among other things, some form of free tuition for higher education and some form of debt forgiveness. And Biden was initially very opposed to both of these, but has come around to support them in different ways. So it may be that he pushes out some form of, say, a state grant to reduce the cost of public tuition, at least at community colleges, if not maybe at state universities. And if that happens, that'll have a lot of impact. I mean, we've already seen this, for example, in New York State, where that state's Excelsior program has driven a lot of private universities and colleges to lose enrollment because so many of that state's residents have gone to public institutions. It's also possible that a Biden administration will crack down on for-profits. So we would have to watch for that as well. I don't know about debt forgiveness at this point. The Biden administration would have so many priorities for expenditures coming up. And I don't know if they'd be able to argue for some form of student debt forgiveness to be there. Personally, I think that would be great if they did, but I just don't know if they'll be able to do that. I mean, so those are a few areas. I mean, there's also reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, and then there's a bunch of other issues that impact higher education in different ways. For example, would the Biden administration support open access and scholarly publication, as well as open education resources, as the Obama administration did from time to time? That would be interesting in terms of impacting how we access scholarly materials, as well as textbooks and other materials. That's a very long-winded answer to your very smart question.
Well, but it's a very complicated question, right? I mean, and I mean, college debt is this huge albatross that students are facing. And I think that this has many people wondering if higher education is really worth the price of admission. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of parents across the country who keep asking that question, especially with more places considering things like the benefits of badging and the importance of a community college degree, an associate's degree, to show competency measurements in education. How are schools going to right this ship? Because you have faculty who are growing older, who are making more. You have land universities that have to pay a lot of money for the brick and mortar buildings. And now everybody's been pushed into, being at least remote, if not online, which most of it was remote. So with a lot of schools starting to move in that direction and the blowing up of the cost of education, how is higher education gonna reverse this?
Well, I think in many ways your picture is too optimistic. We have in 2020 we've suffered additional blows. The public universities, which is about 2/3 of higher ed in the U.S., they are suffering badly because state governments are suffering badly. State governments, after all, the U.S., we experienced a terrible recession, which is still going on. So that cuts revenues. And at the same time, state governments have to pay out more, either in terms of unemployment insurance or in terms of public health measures. And we know historically and politically that cutting public higher education is one of the easiest and first things that states, red and blue, all over the US will do. And we've already seen case after case of that happen. And it's going to keep happening, especially as we work further into this fiscal year, much less looking at the 2021-2022 fiscal year. So state institutions will suffer from that. We know that some degree of families, as well as individuals, will not want to attend higher education, either because they fear infection, which is not an unreasonable fear from face-to-face schooling, or those that see online education as inferior, or at least not worth the cost. And we've seen evidence of this. The total enrollment in American higher education went down 4% this fall. It's continuing a trend that I and others have documented going back almost 9 years now. And since the overwhelming supermajority of colleges and universities depend primarily on tuition for revenue, that's a really serious hit. I think they're going to continue to try to enroll as many wealthy students as possible, which they've been doing. But one source of that has also gone down, which is international students. Again, in part because of geopolitics, rising tensions between the US and China, as well as Trump administration policies towards the Middle East and Africa, as well as the coronavirus has reduced the amount of students coming into the US. Now, we're not the worst in this. The worst is probably Australia, which lost up to 1/3 of its student body, which is just clobbering that country's universities. But still, that's a major cut, especially because international students are so much more likely to pay full freight. There are other issues and other problems having to do with colleges that have residential wings, losing that from those that haven't been able to be open. Colleges and universities having to spend more on everything from paying out for PPE, buying square miles of plexiglass, as well as renovating buildings. Again, none of this is cheap. None of this is free or easy. At the same time, their medical costs are almost certainly going to rise. And you will see, all kinds of micropolitical challenges as well. How do you convince faculty and staff who are, say, over 60 and or have comorbidities to get on campus? We've already seen university presidents and deans urging faculty to do this. I was very entertained by the University of Florida president, who had this great video where he said, please come back to campus, come back to the classroom, teach. That's a great experience. And by the way, if you don't, there'll be job cuts. I mean, he was pretty straightforward and clear about this. So given all this, what can higher education do? I think one of the big responses we're going to see is a big shuffling of the curriculum. That is placing more institutional resources in departments that generate more throughput, that have more majors, more minors, more degrees awarded. And we're going to see cuts to those that don't. Generally speaking, that usually means a push towards STEM, plus econ and business, and a move away from the arts and humanities. I'm not saying this with any satisfaction. As you mentioned in your introduction, my own PhDs in literature, I think this is terrible, but that's where the numbers are right now. In fact, in particular, we should expect to see the emergence of a COVID curriculum. I mean, think how many 18-year-olds who are trying to figure out what to do with their lives, which is one of the functions of traditional age undergraduate experience, as well as how many adults who are going back, in a terrible economy, trying to reskill for new jobs, thinking, what can they give back to society during this crisis? Well, some number of them are going to want to take classes that are oriented around COVID. I mean, think pre-med, obviously, but also think of the wide variety of disciplines within allied health. Think about anesthesiology, think about geriatrics, think about mental health counseling, as well as related fields. I mean, right now I'm hearing rumors that poli-sci and econ are seeing enrollments tick up because both of those fields, politics and economics, have suffered some degree of chaos over the past 1 to 4 years. So it may be that we have a COVID curriculum that helps rebalance the books. It may be as well that we see more and more cuts, more and more layoffs, more program closures, and then ultimately some colleges and universities just shutting down or merging. The demographics are not friendly to keeping the current establishment of higher education running, especially without international students. So yeah, I think we may see a smaller, less dense, leaner higher education in just a couple of years.
Well, it would seem like it really sort of has to go in that direction, and it was certainly going in that direction. And it's funny because you mentioned two things. You mentioned the attitude towards online learning, and I recently did a session, a Coffee Talk episode with Jennifer Mathis from from OLC, and we had a conversation about the difference between remote learning and online learning. And I asked her outright, how do you get this? There's this image that online learning is bad. It's not as good as face-to-face learning. And, in some instances, and for some people, that may be true. I just think it's terrible to paint it all with one brush. But it's interesting, the conversations I find myself having with people who aren't in higher education, who say, well, tuition is so high. And I say to them, tuition, it's like going to a restaurant. The restaurant doesn't make money on your entree. They make it on your soda and on your dessert and on your appetizer. And the soda, dessert, and appetizer in higher ed is parking, dorms, and food services. And without parking, dorms, and food services, how are universities who have built an entire economic model on that providing them with some backdrop, how are they going to adjust to that reduction? And you sort of had alluded to that, during your answer. So I think this is a very complicated problem, and one I'm glad I'm not in the middle of trying to figure out.
Well, let me add one more bit to this, which is that overall, I mean, what we've experienced in the huge shift online in the past generation, among other things, is there's this general customer sense that online means less expensive. Your Facebook fee, or I'm sorry, Facebook is free. Gmail is free. You think about the lower costs for a lot of content in Amazon or in iTunes. You think about the insanely good value of Netflix streaming, for what, 13, 16 bucks a month, getting just, dozens and dozens of hours. I mean, it's a tremendous value. So we're accustomed to that. So, if I take a class with you, I expect, fantastic pedagogy and great design and all that, but I might also expect just to pay less simply because it's online. And I think that adds to the problem that colleges and universities are having, which is why we see so many lawsuits, urging a refund from spring 2020 costs or payments. And we're also seeing just a lot of pressure on higher ed to reduce costs. And the problem with reducing costs in higher ed, I mean, one of the biggest problems is that in order to make higher ed work, we have to hire a lot of professionals who are very well credentialed, masters, PhDs, and not just the faculty, but also a lot of staff who are in professional fields, everything from admissions to computing to library. And in order to do that, those people do not come cheap. Now, we've invented ways of making them cheaper. For example, in the faculty, where we have adjuncts, the biggest pool of faculty in the country, adjuncts are paid below McDonald's wages, and it's a humanitarian disaster, which almost nobody outside of higher ed knows. And I expect that most colleges and universities are either going to expand their reliance on adjuncts or cut a lot of adjuncts and try and squeeze as much teaching as they can out of their full-time tenured faculty. But that's, again, those are not going to save a lot of money. The fact is that teaching is not an easy or cheap thing to do. It requires investment. And I think right now we're having a massive rethink of just how to do that investment.
Yeah, I agree. So you've been pretty busy the last few months. You wrote this little book, and I'd like to read what people see when they go to Amazon. By the way, go to Amazon and get this book. It's wonderful. And the book's called, and I don't make any money off of that, Academia Next, The Futures of Higher Education. How will current trends transform American higher education over the course of the next 20 years? And I just want to read on to this little blurb. The outlook for the future of colleges and universities is uncertain. Financial stresses, changing student populations, and rapidly developing technologies all pose significant challenges to the nation's colleges and universities. In Academia Next, futurist and higher education expert Bryan Alexander addresses these evolving trends to better understand higher education's next generation. Now, I know you well enough to know that you choose your words very, very carefully, and you refer to futures, plural, the futures of higher education. What did you mean by that?
Well, partly it's part of the profession of futurism that we don't like to say, oh, here's a crystal ball, right? We don't like to whip these out and say AJ will be president in 2030. We don't want to do that, in part because the world just doesn't work that way. But also our goal is to help people think. And one of the ways of doing that is to show them multiple paths forward. Among other things, that gives people a sense of agency, where they can say, all right, well, here are these 6 possible scenarios. I really like scenario number 3. Now, let's get to work and make sure that happens. Let's do everything we can to make sure scenario number 6 doesn't happen. I mean, that's a very practical way to move forward. So, I mean, that's part of it. But the other thing is that higher education, now this book focuses on American higher education. I mean, it touches on international higher education throughout, but the main focus is on the United States. That's partly because the US is huge and has such a leading role in higher education worldwide, and so important, and partly to be able to fit it all in one book. And American higher education is unusual on the world stage in a few ways, one of which is it's not organized. It's really disorganized and disaggregated. I mean, about a third of higher education in the US is private, which means these are nonprofits or for-profits that operate autonomously. So federal and state governments have very little to say about them. And the 2/3 that are public, that is, they are funded, they're established and to some extent funded by state governments, those state governments exert usually not a lot of effective oversight to how these behave. And they don't organize them into teams or sequences very much. So I mean, generally, if you have roughly 4,400 colleges and universities in the US, you're going to see all kinds of responses to every possible stimulus. So you may see, say, in Pennsylvania, that state's excellent public university system, you may see that state consolidate, shut down a bunch of its public universities and merge them into a few. Meanwhile, across the country, the excellent California State University system benefits from that state's unusually high commitment to higher education, and they may just continue to grow. You may see elite liberal arts colleges like, say, Vassar or Middlebury or Williams just continue to move from strength to strength based in part on their reputation and on their wealth. And then you may see some other private liberal arts colleges go out of existence because they're just a few more rungs down the ladder of reputation. I mean, it's an enormous canvas with quite a few different actors. So again, it's plural. In the second part of the book, I offer a range of scenarios, possible colleges and universities, which are very different from each other. I mean, one of them is deliberately low tech, for example. 2 of them are very, very high tech. And it's possible that we'll just see all of these play out. If you go to Nevada, you might see an example of retro campus. If you go to Maine, you might see an example of Tutor Me Siri. If you go to New York State, you may see examples of the healthcare nation development and so on. So it's futures in part because that's how we work in the futures field, but also higher education in the US is plural.
Yeah. And also, for those out there who are not just interested in the pedagogical approach, Bryan in his book covers all aspects of the academic experience, including athletics and a lot of the back of the house stuff. So it's really addressing it from a 360 perspective. But one thing I want to bring up is, and this is probably why you've been a little busy, we've talked about this, I can't reference the page number because I'm reading mine digitally and I don't get page numbers, but I think you've referred to it as the dreaded page 26. But the word pandemic appears 4 times in your book, which is not, it's not out all that long before the pandemic, but not all that long. In fact, in chapter 1, ironically called Objects in the Mirror May Be Closer Than They Appear, you say, and I quote, "For example, imagine a future academy after a major pandemic has struck the world, perhaps along the lines of the early 20th century Great Influenza. To envision the institution under such pressure, we would have to think about multiple disciplines and domains." So first off, wow. I mean, you wrote that long before we had to face this, but what did you mean by that, about that last sentence there, and about thinking through multiple disciplines and domains, and how, if at all, has your thinking changed since COVID?
Well, it is the dreaded page 23, which nobody noticed
23.
until March, and then everybody started freaking out when they saw it, saying, what kind of dark forces are you in league with? Well, and to explain a bit about this, the multiple disciplines we're already seeing in play. That is, if you want to understand how COVID is changing and how it's impacting things, you have to look at epidemiology, obviously. I mean, that's the science of this. And there are a lot of great people doing work in this that we can learn from, benefit from. But we also have to take a look at sociology, trying to figure out, why some people wear masks and what some people don't, why social distancing succeeds here and why it fails. We also have to look at various parts of the overall healthcare spectrum. I mean, thinking, for example, about the stress and trauma of this. What does psychology tell us about this? We can also turn to history. I mean, I mentioned the 1918 Great Influenza. It's usually called the Spanish flu. And it was nicknamed the Spanish flu because this happened during World War I, and Spain was the only neutral country of stature that people could point to. It's actually most likely the Kansas flu because it seems to have started near Fort Leavenworth. But a devastating pandemic. I mean, the worst one in modern history. I mean, we can learn a lot by taking a look at how healthcare authorities responded, how popular culture responded, and so on. And then on and on. We can look at urban studies. I mean, and it's not just me who's saying this. I mean, the futurist field is inherently interdisciplinary. We have to look at everything from economics, demographics, to politics, to environmental, and so on. But also, if you look at classes that have been taught on COVID by schools as diverse as, say, University of Mary Washington in Virginia, or Reed College, or Whitman College, or Oberlin College, where they've had interdisciplinary approaches. They've had people from communications, from Spanish history, from epidemiology. I mean, all of them taking a look at different ways that the epidemic plays out. So it really is a interdisciplinary thing. Your
So
second question was, how's my thinking changed?
yeah, so your approach and your thinking, I mean, you wrote about this a little bit, as a forecast. That was a little crystal ballish, right? So, but things have changed dramatically since March. How has your thinking changed?
Well, a few of us have said in public that the one thing that completely surprised us was that the CDC would be incompetent. Nobody anticipated this. And part of it is Trump, but it's not entirely Trump. The CDC made some unforced errors on its own. And that is something which we just didn't anticipate at all. If you want, go look at the superb 2012 movie Contagion, where the CDC are straight up the heroes. I mean, they're the competent ones that win the day. And, of course, I think it'll be decades before the CDC's reputation can come back. In March and April, I started forecasting what this would look like in higher education. I created a few different scenarios, and all 3 of those scenarios are now in play. So it's exciting to see that. So in a sense, my thinking didn't change, it just expanded in order to include all these different possibilities. I was also surprised by how slight the decrease in enrollment was. I thought actually we'd see a drop below 4%. I was expecting something like 6 to 10, and that hasn't happened. So it looks like higher education has been very successful in convincing people to return. The game designer and scholar Ian Bogost has an interesting piece in The Atlantic where he talks about how much America is committed to residential education. And I think there's a lot of truth in what he says. We do have a lot invested in that, and which is why we are willing to risk disease and death. We've already had at least 6 people die on campuses this fall semester, including one university president. We have no idea how many people are infected or have been infected because there's no source is gathering all of that data. The New York Times tried their best. They threw dozens, literally dozens of reporters at this, and they caught maybe 40% of U.S. higher education. I mean, this is this is a sidebar, but this is an incredible documentary failure going on right now. Individual campuses, some of them are publishing dashboards, but the dashboards are all over the map. There's no standard. They're showing whatever they like in different formats, different software, revealing or concealing different things. But the data is lousy. All we know is that some number of people in American higher education are infected, some number have died, and some number are injured. I mean, this is another sidebar, but this is another part of COVID that isn't really getting enough attention. That besides the deaths and recoveries, there is a portion of people who are injured that suffer tissue damage of some kind, from the brain to general nervous system to lung tissue to heart tissue, and that this will persist for years, if not life. Some are calling people who have this long haulers, and we have no good numbers on what proportion that is. So we have long haulers on our campuses right now. We don't know how many, but that full picture is one that I've been trying to envision.
I can't imagine. So one more thing about out of the book, I don't want to spend too much time in it. I want to get onto something else, but you say, and this was a quote that caught me and I wanted to ask you about it. You say, quote, possibilities for excellence and extinction stand in conflict. Can you say more about that?
Sure. Those are two extremes. And in terms of design or in terms of pedagogy or heuristics, one approach we have in the future of the world is to show two extreme opposites. We can think utopia and dystopia, or in this case, excellence and extinction. I think I've described some of the ways of extinction that could happen. We lived in Vermont for the past almost 20 years, and a handful of colleges and universities have gone out of existence there, and probably a couple more will come soon. So we know about extinction, but excellence, one of the astonishing things about our time, AJ, it's difficult to actually say this. I know people have gotten in trouble for saying, well, there are good things, or there is a silver lining, but there are positive features. And again, my task is to be open to the full range of possibility, and I can't turn away from things because they might be unpalatable or ill-timed. For the past couple of decades, we've had an unprecedented focus on teaching and learning. You think about the National Academy of Sciences, they're awesome books on how we learn, which actually show the science of learning, because we've had this small revolution in being able to look at human brains and nervous systems and muscular systems as we put them through the process of learning, which is tremendous. We have this huge growth in teaching and learning centers. We have the boom in the instructional design field. In fact, one of the great populations of heroes in 2020 has been the instructional designers, along with academic technologists, educational technologists, who in March of 2020 helped haul higher education online with no resources, no time, just on the spot, and did it. And then you have all these professors who ask the question, how do I teach online? Instructional designers can say, we know exactly how to help you. We have generation plus of scholarship, of practice to point to. So, we have that field, and that's been growing and growing. And on top of this, I think the threat of extinction, or at least decay or danger, has driven some campuses to rethink how they teach and to do it better. On top of that, this is a little controversial, but Clay Shirky and others have observed that the online world has with it this kind of culture of continuous improvement that might not always be a good thing. I mean, you could think about your favorite website that changes its interface when you didn't want it to, but there is that sense of fluidity and constant iteration. So it may be that if we're teaching remotely or online in different ways, if we're doing all of that, that we have more opportunities to improve that teaching more rapidly. I mean, somebody who is teaching with Zoom for the first time or with Microsoft Teams or Shindig or whatever, they're rethinking how they present and how they facilitate. That's pretty beneficial. If I can get literary on you for a second, back in the 1920s, a wonderful Soviet theorist named Shklovsky came up with this idea of defamiliarization. This is when you have an artistic technique that takes something that was familiar and ordinary and makes it unfamiliar and surprising. And I think, all academics know how to lecture, not necessarily well. But now on Zoom, we have to rethink that. I mean, we all know how to ask questions, again, not necessarily well, but through Microsoft Teams or Shindig or whatever, we have to rethink that. And we have to rethink it asynchronously as well. So I think there's this great learning moment coming on that we're in the middle of, and we should really celebrate.
So that kind of leads me into one of the two questions I plan to ask at the end of every one of these coffee talks, and it may be a little bit easier for you because of the nature of the question, but what are the great accomplishments that we can look back on over the last year?
Two big ones right off the bat. One of them is the insanely fast, insanely huge migration online that I was just referring to. That was something which the word unprecedented is often overused. I prefer to use the term extraordinary, literally out of the ordinary. But this really is unprecedented. We've never done this in higher ed. We haven't moved nearly the entire pedagogical apparatus of American academia online in a couple of weeks or a couple of days. I think that's extraordinary. And we're still learning about this, and we're still learning lessons about this. I think the second thing that is so important about this is because we've been experiencing what some call a great awakening or a great awakening or a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, however you phrase it, a lot of the United States is rethinking racism and social justice. And in higher education, we're definitely doing this. I mean, everything from thinking about the names of buildings and statues and campuses to the representation of minoritized populations in the curriculum or on staff or among boards of trustees and so on. And I think that we are doing all this work, thinking about excellence and extinction, thinking about COVID and all of this, with an eye towards social justice. I think that's just a terrific thing. It's long overdue, but it's a really, really good thing. I mean, so those are two great things. I'll add one more, just because 3 is a magic number. We have what you and I are doing now. We're in different states, we're different institutions. We do have beards, but besides that, we're pretty different. But we're communicating, and we have your audience, both the synchronous audience on YouTube right now, as well as the asynchronous audience that's listening to this later on. Hello there. But we have this great opportunity for communication and collaboration, which is not how humans always respond to crises. I mean, one of our typical responses is to get defensive, is to pull in and dig deep and hide. The turtle movement of taking your soft body parts and pulling them under the hard shell. I mean, that's a very, very human response, actually. But what we're doing now is we're reaching out. People in community colleges, talking to people in liberal arts colleges, talking to people at Research One universities, who are talking to publishers and librarians and galleries and museums and state governments, trying to figure out how you do all of this. How do you handle social presence online? How do you handle communication? How do you handle giving students a good education during this extraordinary time? I think this burst of collaborative and communicative action is a tremendous thing that we should really be proud of and keep doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for referring to this as a beard. This is fuzz, especially compared to what you've got. And I agree with you. Something that astounded me, and I don't know how to express this to people when we talk about it, but what I saw and helped in many ways over a 10-day to 2-week period was an amazingly altruistic effort that I'm not sure we will ever be able to capture the gravity of, because these are people who took countless hours that would not have been spent otherwise. And they really do care about their students. And of course, there's a bell curve here, right? But I was just astounded at the generosity in attitude and just the way we all pulled together. One thing I've always said about Americans is that we're really good with each other in a crisis. We don't celebrate things as well as other places, but we do come together in a crisis and really pull together. And I watched my colleagues, amazing colleagues at Montclair State University. I am so proud of the people who work there and the faculty who work there. But I have reach and friends in schools all over the country, all over the world, and they're all telling the same story. And I agree with you. I think that the things that you mentioned were great accomplishments. What are we going to be talking about next year at this time?
A few different things, and much depends on, of course, how politics turns out, and also how the pandemic turns out. I mean, there are a lot of projections that show COVID just increasing in its infection rate and total number of affected people through next spring and possibly next summer. So we just cracked 100,000 cases a day now. 250,000 dead. This time next year, let's say that we have 500,000 dead. Let's say that we have 8 to 10% of the American population has been infected. How does that change us? I think, among other things, we'll be looking at how online learning has kind of deepened, or how it's become more and more normalized. We may look at how higher education institutions have changed in the ways I've described. How many have consolidated or closed or cut. We'll have a sense as well as what the COVID curriculum looks like, how enrollment has changed. It should be very, very interesting. And we also may see changes starting to appear in the built environment. That is the physical campus buildings, plazas, squares, quadrangles, and so on. I mean, there's a lot of talk about this in the architecture and planning world. For example, in 1918, there was a big shift towards more open air windows in buildings, because the idea then was that was a better way to improve the health of patients. So maybe we will see now, for example, more classroom buildings, administrative buildings, and residence halls, and so on, that have more windows, bigger windows, more doors, bigger doors, fewer inside-only rooms within buildings, and bigger rooms because you have to do social distancing. You may also have some interesting single-purpose rooms, such as one-person rooms, or bigger porches or front halls in order to allow for distancing and transportation. We may see more outdoor structures being built, everything from gazebos and palazzos, but also thinking about having more semi-permanent structures like well-established tents available outside. We already have seen outside of academia, there's talk that restaurants are going to shrink the size or the number of their dining rooms and instead have more and more drive-through and pickup. So you may see, for example, restaurants that have no dining room, but they have 2 or 3 lanes for drive-through. So you think about higher ed that way. What are some of the ways that our built environment will change? In terms of the whole struggle over racism, I expect we will see, to some extent, greater numbers of Black, Latino, Indigenous populations represented among faculty and perhaps among leadership, including boards. We may also see a whole crop of research about what we've just experienced. I've been part of a project at Georgetown called the Big Rethink, where we did 2 seminars. One's going on right now, graduate seminars about what this has done to higher education. And we've interviewed dozens of great people. I put those interviews up on YouTube. So we're contributing to this, and we're trying to build more information about how campuses change, what we can learn from all of that. So we should have a lot of research to be able to discuss and draw on. And for example, right now, one quiet, but I think very important body of research is in the epidemic world, trying to figure out how campuses spread COVID. And some of the early findings are, if you have a residential campus, or if you bring students to campus in large numbers, you're going to spread COVID further. So we may be discussing a whole galaxy of lawsuits and their forms of liability around this. So those are some of the things. The political aspect, again, as I said before, it depends on who wins the election. It may be this time next year, we'll be in the throes of the Biden administration trying to get through some form of public support for tuition. It may be that a Trump administration in November of 2021 is trying to buck up all the for-profits, and the for-profits are continuing to grow. So we'll be talking about that, assuming, of course, that we haven't descended into some form of civil war and chaos and military rule, which is unlikely. Just to give your listeners and viewers one less reason for a cardiac incident. So I think we'll be thinking about that, but also on a more counseling level, I think we'll be dealing with an enormous mental health crisis within higher education. I mean, you think about people in the New York City area, which includes you, AJ, who in the spring of this year endured the worst bout of COVID that America has seen. And we know faculty, staff, students perished in New York. Everybody had to live with this. A good friend of mine had a morgue truck parked in his block in Brooklyn. Now we extend that for 2 years. What happens to our minds with that persistence of trauma? And we know from the history of pandemics, we have some lessons to learn. We know that some people become inured to the or desensitized or
Mhm.
to suffering. Others break down or withdraw in different ways. So we'll have that spectrum of mental health behaviors going on within higher education, including faculty and staff, and of course students. So that's a quick sketch for next year. We have to check in, I think, a year from now and see how we're doing.
It's a date. So I have to say that Bryan is very generous with his time with things. I'm going to give him a second to talk about his future trends forum, but I know Bryan initially because I had seen him at conferences speaking, and he's always publishing. He's always putting something out there. He mentioned YouTube not that long ago. So if you were to Google Bryan Alexander, you will find pages and pages of useful, incredible stuff. But why don't you talk a little bit about the Future Trends Forum and some of the other stuff you make available to educators?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for saying those very kind things. My passionate belief is that people learn well together. And it's a kind of open source attitude, but it's also I think, a pedagogical attitude as well as a kind of anarchistic attitude based on some faith in the human race. I'm very fond of Rebecca Solnit, who's a terrific writer, has a wonderful book called A Paradise Built in Hell, where she describes how if you look at great disasters and catastrophes, rather than people descending into a kind of Mad Max free-for-all hellscape, what you usually see is a burst of help and cooperation. What you were referring to, AJ, about half an hour ago, that kind of spirit of mutual aid, cooperation, and selflessness. And I want to celebrate that. So in my own work, I push things out in part because I want to hear back from everybody else. People who are smarter than me, people who know more stuff than I do, people who are actually epidemiologists, right? People who are actually computer programmers who can tell me things. So that makes my work smarter. That improves what I do. So I everything I do, I push out through social media just to provoke that kind of current. I mean, my Patreon followers and supporters, for example, I always push things out to them because they are so wise. And I learned so much from them. So one aspect of this is I do a weekly video conference called the Future Trends Forum. It's been running for almost 5 years now, where every week we get some fantastic guest or a pair of guests, and I put them up with dozens, if not hundreds of other people, so they can have a conversation about some part of the future of higher education. It could be, there's a wide range of topics. So yesterday we had a wonderful guy, Sunny Ramaswamy, who is the head of one regional accreditation body. He was telling us about how accreditation works, which is great. We've had people talking about open access and scholarly publication, talking about the science of learning, talking about libraries, talking about artificial intelligence. We've had everything from a gubernatorial candidate for state governor. We've had entrepreneurs. We've had critics. And every time it's not me what I'm doing now of talking, it's me as an MC connecting that person along with the hundreds of people from the Future Transform community. It's a fantastic discussion. I'm always so thrilled and rewarded by it. I think the Future Transform is fairly unique right now. But again, we're saying this, AJ, you and I are having this conversation when the entire United States is teetering on the brink of this election, where among other things, we have had, on a good thing, an incredibly high turnout. I mean, proportionally. This is arguably the highest turnout since around 1908. I mean, it's an incredibly good, which is a great achievement for the United States. We need to have this. But it's also one that has revealed a completely divided country, a partisanized country, a country with lots of echo chambers where conversations are harder and harder to have. And so I think it's kind of my ethical duty to try and make a place, even if just for 1 hour a week, where we can have conversations that are rich, dynamic, conflicted, and supportive all at the same time.
Well, as an industry, we're lucky to have you and the people that you have around you, and you talk about all the time. And thank you for everything that you do. As I imagined it would be, it was an incredible pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. It was incredible to be able to share that with everybody. And I'm going to track you down a year from now. We're going to replay your little clip at the beginning, but then we'll have a spirited conversation again. Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your being here today. By the way, everything that Bryan talked about will be either in the description down below, or we're going to, once we do the post-production on this, we'll have, those little signs at the bottom that'll tell you, give you his contact information and whatnot. But that's all that we have time for today. Thank you for joining us for Coffee Talk, produced by the student team in the Center for the Digital Humanities, which is part of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Montclair State University. For more information on past and future Coffee Talk episodes, visit us on the web. Go to www.montclair.edu and search for the Center for the Digital Humanities. We also kindly ask that down below, wherever it is here, you click that big red subscribe button in YouTube, or follow us on IGTV if that's where you're seeing this. And you can keep up on all this and all of our other video content. Not only can you find the Center for the Digital Humanities on YouTube and Instagram, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at CHSSCDH. And if you're at Montclair State University, soon enough, you'll be able to find us on Engage. Thanks again for joining us. Be good to yourselves and be good to each other.